E. The British agricultural proletariat. Nowhere does the antagonistic character of capitalistic production and accumulation assert itself more brutally than in the progress of English agriculture, including cattle breeding, and the retrogression of the English agricultural laborer. Before I turn to their present situation, a rapid retrospect. Modern agriculture dates in England from the middle of the 18th century, although the revolution in landed property, from which the changed mode of production starts as a basis, has a much earlier date. If we take the statements of Arthur Young, a careful observer though a superficial thinker, as to the agricultural laborer of 1771, the latter plays a very pitiable part compared with his predecessor of the end of the 14th century, quote, when the laborer could live in plenty and accumulate wealth, unquote, not to speak of the 15th century, quote, the golden age of the English laborer in town and country, unquote. We need not, however, go back so far. In a very instructive work of the year 1777, we read, quote, the great farmer is nearly mounted to a level with him, meaning the gentleman, while the poor laborer is depressed almost to the earth. His unfortunate situation will fully appear by taking a comparative view of it only 40 years ago, and at present, landlord and tenant have both gone hand in hand in keeping the laborer down. That quotes from Reasons for the Late Increase of the Poor Rates, or a Comparative View of the Prices of Labor and Provisions, 1777, and the earlier quote about the laborer living in plenty and accumulating wealth is from James E. Thorold Rogers, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Oxford's A History of Agriculture and Prices in England, 1866, Volume 1. This work, the fruit of patient and diligent labor, contains in the 2 volumes that have so far appeared only the period from 1259 to 1400. The second volume contains simply statistics. It is the first authentic history of prices of the time that we possess. Continuing the main text, it is then proved in detail that the real agricultural wages between 1737 and 1777 fell nearly 1/4, or 25%. Quote, modern policy, says Dr. Richard Price also, is indeed more favorable to the higher classes of people, and the consequences may in time prove that the whole kingdom will consist of only gentry and beggars, or of grandees and slaves. Footnote that's quoting Dr. Richard Price's Observations on Reversionary Payments, 6th edition, 1803, Volume 2. Price remarks on page 159, quote, the nominal price of day labor is at present no more than about 4 times, or at most 5 times higher than it was in the year 1514. But the price of corn is 7 times, and of flesh meat and raiment about 15 times higher. So far, therefore, has the price of labor been, even from advancing in proportion to the increase in the expenses of living, that it does not appear that it bears now half the proportion to those expenses that it did bear. Back to the main text. Nevertheless, the position of the English agricultural laborer from 1770 to 1780 with regard to his food and dwelling, as well as to his self-respect, amusements, etc., is an ideal never attained again since that time. His average wage, expressed in pints of wheat, was from 1770 to 1771 90 pints. In Eden's time, 1797, only 65. In 1808, but 60. The state of the agricultural laborer at the end of the anti-Jacobin War, during which landed proprietors, farmers, manufacturers, merchants, bakers, stockbrokers, army contractors, etc., enriched themselves so extraordinarily, has been already indicated above. The nominal wages rose in consequence partly of the banknote depreciation, partly of a rise in the price of the primary means of subsistence, independent of this depreciation. But the actual wage variation can be evidenced in a very simple way, without entering into details that are here unnecessary. The Poor Law and its administration were in 1795 and 1814 the same. It'll be remembered how this law was carried out in the country districts. In the form of alms, the parish made up the nominal wage to the nominal sum required for the simple vegetation of the laborer. The ratio between the wages paid by the farmer and the wage deficit made good by the parish shows us 2 things. First, the falling of wages below their minimum. Second, the degree in which the agricultural laborer was a compound of wage laborer and pauper, or the degree in which he had been turned into a serf of his parish. Let us take one county that represents the average condition of things in all counties. In Northamptonshire, in 1795, the average weekly wage was 7 shillings 6 pence. The total yearly expenditure of a family of 6 persons, £36, 12 shillings 5 pence. Their total income, £29, 18 shillings. The deficit made good by the parish, £6, 14 shillings 5 pence. In 1814, in the same county, the weekly wage was 12 shillings 2 pence. The total yearly expenditure of a family of 5 persons, £54, 18 shillings 4 pence. Their total income, £36, 2 shillings. The deficit made good by the parish, £18, 6 shillings 4 pence. In 1795, the deficit was less than a quarter the wage. In 1814, more than half. It is self-evident that under these circumstances, the meager comforts that Eden still found in the cottage of the agricultural laborer had vanished by 1814. Of all the animals kept by the farmer, the laborer, the instrumentum vocale, was thenceforth the most oppressed, the worst nourished, the most brutally treated. The same state of things went on quietly until, quote, the swing riots in 1830 revealed to us, i.e. the ruling classes, by the light of blazing corn stacks, that misery and black mutinous discontent smoldered quite as fiercely under the surface of agricultural as of manufacturing England. That's quoting Lang. At this time, Sadler, in the House of Commons, christened the agricultural laborers white slaves, and a bishop echoed the epithet in the upper house. The most notable political economist of that period, E.G. Wakefield, says, quote, the peasant of the south of England is not a freeman, nor is he a slave. He is a pauper. The time just before the repeal of the Corn Laws threw new light on the condition of the agricultural laborers. On the one hand, it was to the interest of the middle-class agitators to prove how little the Corn Laws protected the actual producers of the corn. On the other hand, the industrial bourgeoisie foamed with sullen rage at the denunciations of the factory system by the landed aristocracy, at the pretended sympathy with the woes of the factory operatives, of those utterly corrupt, heartless, and genteel loafers, and at their diplomatic zeal for factory legislation. It is an old English proverb that when thieves fall out, honest men come by their own. And in fact, the noisy, passionate quarrel between the two fractions of the ruling class about the question which of the two exploited the laborers the more shamefully was on each hand the midwife of the truth. Earl Shaftesbury, then Lord Ashley, was commander-in-chief in the aristocratic, philanthropic, anti-factory campaign. He was, therefore, in 1845, a favorite subject in the revelations of the Morning Chronicle on the condition of the agricultural laborers. This journal, then the most important liberal organ, sent special commissioners into the agricultural districts, who did not content themselves with mere general descriptions and statistics, but published the names both of the laboring families examined and of their landlords. The following list gives the wages paid in 3 villages in the neighborhood of Blandford, Wimborne, and Poole. The villages are the property of Mr. G. Banks and of the Earl of Shaftesbury. It will be noted that just like Banks, this, quote, low church pope, this head of English pietists, pockets a great part of the miserable wages of the laborers under the pretext of house rent. And there are 3 charts presented which are too long for me to read here, but which I will put on the screen. The first village again is Blandford, the second, Wimborne, and the third, Poole. And there's a footnote. The landed aristocracy advanced themselves to this end, of course per Parliament, funds from the state treasury at a very low rate of interest, which the farmers have to make good at a much higher rate. That's in reference to the weekly income per head. Resuming the main text, the repeal of the Corn Laws gave a marvelous impulse to English agriculture. Drainage on the most extensive scale, new methods of stall feeding, and of the artificial cultivation of green crops, introduction of mechanical manuring apparatus, new treatment of clay soils, increased use of mineral manures, employment of the steam engine, and of all kinds of new machinery, more intensive cultivation generally characterized this epoch. Mr. Pusey, chairman of the Royal Agricultural Society, declares that the relative expenses of farming have been reduced nearly 1/2 by the introduction of new machinery. On the other hand, the actual return of the soil rose rapidly, greater outlay of capital per acre, and as a consequence, more rapid concentration of farms were essential conditions of the new method. Footnote, the decrease of the middle-class farmers can be seen especially in the census category, farmer's son, grandson, brother, nephew, daughter, granddaughter, sister, or niece. In a word, the members of his own family employed by the farmer. This category numbered in 1851 216,851 persons. In 1861, only 176,151. From 1851 to 1871, the farms under 20 acres fell by more than 900 in number. Those between 50 and 75 acres fell from 8,253 to 6,370. The same thing occurred with all other farms under 100 acres. On the other hand, during the same 20 years, the number of large farms increased. Those of 300 to 500 acres rose from 7,771 to 8,410. those of more than 500 acres from 2,755 to 3,914, those of more than 1,000 acres from 492 to 582. Back to the main text. At the same time, the area under cultivation increased from 1846 to 1856 by 464,119 acres, without reckoning the great area in the eastern counties which was transformed from rabbit warrens and poor pastures into magnificent cornfields. It has already been seen that, at the same time, the total number of persons employed in agriculture fell. As far as the actual agricultural laborers of both sexes and of all ages are concerned, their number fell from 1,241,396 in 1851 to 1,163,217 in 1861. And a footnote, the number of shepherds increased from 12,517 to 25,559. Back to the main text. If the English Registrar General, therefore, rightly remarks, quote, "The increase of farmers and farm laborers since 1801 bears no kind of proportion to the increase of agricultural produce," that's quoting the census, "this disproportion obtains much more for the last period, when a positive decrease of the agricultural population went hand in hand with increase of the area under cultivation, with more intensive cultivation, unheard of accumulation of the capital incorporated with the soil and devoted to its working, an augmentation in the products of the soil without parallel in the history of English agriculture, plethoric rent rolls of landlords, and growing wealth of the capitalist farmers. If we take this together with the swift, unbroken extension of the markets, viz. The towns, and the reign of free trade, then the agricultural laborer was at last, through diverse mishaps, placed in circumstances that normally ought to have made him drunk with happiness. But Professor Rogers comes to the conclusion that the lot of the English agricultural laborer of today, not to speak of his predecessor in the last half of the 14th and in the 15th century, but only compared with his predecessor from 1770 to 1780, has changed for the worse to an extraordinary extent, that, quote, "the peasant has again become a serf," unquote, and a serf worse fed and worse clothed. Footnote, Mr. Rogers belongs to the liberal school, is a personal friend of Cobden and Bright, and therefore no praiser of times past. Back to the main text. Dr. Julian Hunter, in his epoch-making report on the dwellings of the agricultural laborers, says, quote, "The cost of the hind," Marx adds this is a name for the agricultural laborer, inherited from the time of serfdom, quote, "is fixed at the lowest possible amount on which he can live. The supplies of wages and shelter are not calculated on the profit to be derived from him. He is a zero in farming calculations." Footnote, this is quoting from the Public Health 7th Report, 1865, and Marx adds, "It is therefore nothing unusual either for the landlord to raise a laborer's rent as soon as he hears that he is earning a little more, or for the farmer to lower the wage of the laborer, quote, because his wife has found a trade." Back to the quote, "The means of subsistence being always supposed to be a fixed quantity. As to any further reduction of his income, he may say, death is nothing to us. He has no fears for the future, because he has now only the spare supply necessary to keep him. He has reached the zero from which are dated the calculations of the farmer. Come what will, he has no share, either in prosperity or adversity," unquote. In the year 1863, an official inquiry took place into the conditions of nourishment and labor of the criminals condemned to transportation and penal servitude. The results are recorded in two voluminous blue books. Among other things, it is said, quote, "From an elaborate comparison between the diet of convicts in the convict prisons in England and that of paupers in workhouses and of free laborers in the same country, it certainly appears that the former are much better fed than either of the two other classes. Whilst the amount of labor required from an ordinary convict under penal servitude is about 1/2 of what would be done by an ordinary day laborer," unquote. A few characteristic depositions of witnesses. John Smith, governor of the Edinburgh prison, deposes, quote, "The diet of the English prisons is superior to that of ordinary laborers in England. It is the fact that the ordinary agricultural laborers in Scotland very seldom get any meat at all. Question, is there anything you are aware of to account for the necessity of feeding them very much better than ordinary laborers? Answer, certainly not. Question, do you think that further experiments ought to be made in order to ascertain whether a dietary might not be hit upon for prisoners employed on public works nearly approaching to the dietary of free laborers? Answer, he, the agricultural laborer, might say, I work hard and have not enough to eat, and when in prison I did not work harder where I had plenty to eat, and therefore it is better for me to be in prison again than here." Unquote. From the tables appended to the first volume of the report, I have compiled the annexed comparative summary. And then there's a chart titled Weekly Amount of Nutrients, and there's 3 columns: quantity of nitrogenous ingredients, non-nitrogenous ingredients, and mineral matter for a convict in Portland, a sailor in the Navy, a soldier, a working coachmaker, a compositor, and an agricultural laborer. The highest totals are for the convict, the sailor, and the working coachmaker, with the soldier, the compositor, and the agricultural laborer being much lower. Continuing, the general result of the inquiry by the Medical Commission of 1863 on the food of the lowest fed classes is already known to the reader. You will remember that the diet of a great part of the agricultural laborers' families is below the minimum necessary, quote, "to arrest starvation diseases." This is especially the case in all the purely rural districts of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Wilts, Stafford, Oxford, Berks, and Herts. Quote, "The nourishment obtained by the laborer himself," says Dr. E. Smith, "is larger than the average quantity indicates, since he eats a larger share, necessary to enable him to perform his labor, of food than the other members of the family, including in the poorer districts nearly all the meat and bacon. The quantity of food obtained by the wife and also by the children at the period of rapid growth is in many cases, in almost every county, deficient, and particularly in nitrogen." Unquote. The male and female servants living with the farmers themselves are sufficiently nourished. Their number fell from 288,277 in 1851 to 204,962 in 1861. Quote, "The labor of women in the fields," says Dr. Smith, "whatever may be its disadvantages, is under present circumstances of great advantage to the family, since it adds that amount of income which provides shoes and clothing and pays the rent, and thus enables the family to be better fed." Unquote. One of the most remarkable results of the inquiry was that the agricultural labor of England, as compared with other parts of the United Kingdom, quote, "is considerably the worst fed, as the appended table shows." And we have a table here: quantities of carbon and nitrogen weekly consumed by an average agricultural adult. We will first read down the column for carbon. England, 46,673. Wales, 48,354. Scotland, 48,980. And Ireland, actually the lowest, 43,366. But then for nitrogen, England is by far the lowest, 1,594, Wales 2,031, Scotland 2,348, and Ireland the highest, 2,434. And we have a very long footnote here. The English agricultural laborer receives only 1/4 as much milk and half as much bread as the Irish. Arthur Young, in his Tour in Ireland at the beginning of this century, already noticed the better nourishment of the latter. The reason is simply this, that the poor Irish farmer is incomparably more humane than the rich English. As regards Wales, that which is said in the text holds only for the southwest. All the doctors there agree that the increase of the death rate through tuberculosis, scrofula, etc. increases in intensity with the deterioration of the physical condition of the population, and all ascribe this deterioration to poverty. Quote, "His," meaning the farm laborer's keep, "is reckoned at about 5 pence a day, but in many districts it was said to be of much less cost to the farmer, himself very poor. A morsel of the salt meat or bacon, salted and dried to the texture of mahogany, and hardly worth the difficult process of assimilation, is used to flavor a large quantity of broth or gruel, of meal and leeks, and day after day this is the laborer's dinner." Unquote. The advance of industry resulted for him in this harsh and damp climate in, quote, "the abandonment of the solid homespun clothing in favor of the cheap and so-called cotton goods," unquote, and of stronger drinks for so-called tea. Quote, "The agriculturist, after several hours' exposure to wind and rain, pins his cottage to sit by a fire of peat or balls of clay and small coal kneaded together, from which volumes of carbonic and sulphurous acids are poured forth. His walls are of mud and stones, his floor the bare earth which was there before the hut was built, his roof a mass of loose and sodden thatch. Every crevice is topped to maintain warmth, and in an atmosphere of diabolic odor, with a mud floor, with his only clothes drying on his back, he often sups and sleeps with his wife and children. Obstetricians who have passed parts of the night in such cabins have described how they found their feet sinking in the mud of the floor, and they were forced, easy task, to drill a hole through the wall to effect a little private respiration. It was attested by numerous witnesses in various grades of life that, To these insanitary influences, and many more, the underfed peasant was nightly exposed, and of the result, a debilitated and scrofulous people, there was no want of evidence. The statements of the relieving officers of Carmarthenshire and Cardiganshire show in a striking way the same state of things. There is besides, quote, a plague more horrible still, the great number of idiots, unquote. Now a word on the climatic conditions. Quote, a strong southwest wind blows over the whole country for 8 or 9 months in the year, bringing with it torrents of rain, which discharge principally upon the western slopes of the hills. Trees are rare, except in sheltered places, and where not protected are blown out of all shape. The cottages generally crouch under some bank, or often in a ravine or quarry, and none but the smallest sheep and native cattle can live on the pastures. The young people migrate to the eastern mining districts of Glamorgan and Monmouth. Carmarthenshire is the breeding ground of the mining population and their hospital. The population can therefore barely maintain its numbers, unquote. Thus, in Cardiganshire, in 1851, there were 45,155 males and 52,459 females, a total of 97,614. In 1861, there were 44,446 males and 52,955 females, a total of 97,401. This is according to Dr. Hunter's report in Public Health, 7th Report, 1865. Back to the main text. Quote, to the insufficient quantity and miserable quality of the house accommodation generally had, says Dr. Simon, in his official health report, quote, by our agricultural laborers, almost every page of Dr. Hunter's report bears testimony. And gradually, for many years past, the state of the laborer in these respects has been deteriorating, house room being now greatly more difficult for him to find, and when found, greatly less suitable to his needs than perhaps for centuries had been the case. Especially within the last 20 or 30 years, the evil has been in very rapid increase, and the household circumstances of the laborer are now in the highest degree deplorable, except in so far as they whom his labor enriches see fit to treat him with a kind of pitiful indulgence. He is quite peculiarly helpless in the matter. Whether he shall find house room on the land which he contributes to till, whether the house room which he gets shall be human or swinish, whether he shall have the little space of garden that so vastly lessens the pressure of his poverty, all this does not depend on his willingness and ability to pay reasonable rent for the decent accommodation he requires, but depends on the use which others may see fit to make of their right to do as they will with their own. However large may be a farm, there is no law that a certain proportion of laborers' dwellings, much less of decent dwellings, shall be upon it, nor does any law reserve for the laborer ever so little right in that soil to which his industry is as needful as sun and rain. An extraneous element weighs the balance heavily against him, the influence of the poor law in its provisions concerning settlement and chargeability. Footnote, in 1865 this law was improved to some extent. It will soon be learned from experience that tinkering of this sort is of no use. Back to the main text. Under this influence, each parish has a pecuniary interest in reducing to a minimum the number of its resident laborers. For, unhappily, agricultural labor, instead of implying a safe and permanent independence for the hard-working laborer and their family, implies for the most part only a longer or shorter circuit to eventual pauperism. A pauperism which, during the whole circuit, is so near that any illness or temporary failure of occupation necessitates immediate recourse to parochial relief, and thus all residence of agricultural population in a parish is glaringly an addition to its poor rates. Comment. People have asked about the term precariat, which combines the term proletariat with precarious, as if this is some kind of new condition. I said then, and I'll say it again, that the relative stability of some parts of the proletariat in some countries during some parts of the 20th century was really an exception and anomaly. The precariousness is really implied in the fact that you are a proletarian. Although again, this precarious is not equal to all parts of the proletariat. Still, largely I think that is a cope for people trying to see capitalism as not that bad or whatever. Continuing, large proprietors, and there's a footnote, in order to understand that which follows, we must remember that closed villages are those whose owners are one or two large landlords. Open villages are those whose soil belongs to many smaller landlords. It is in the latter that building speculators can build cottages and lodging houses. Back to the main text. Large proprietors have but to resolve that there shall be no laborers' dwellings on their estates, and their estates will thenceforth be virtually free from half their responsibility for the poor. how far it has been intended in the English Constitution and law that this kind of unconditional property in land should be acquirable, and that a landlord doing as he wills with his own, as is said, should be able to treat the cultivators of the soil as aliens whom he may expel from his territory is a question which I do not pretend to discuss, for that power of eviction does not exist only in theory. On a very large scale it prevails in practice, prevails as a main governing condition in the household circumstances of agricultural labor. As regards the extent of the evil, it may suffice to refer to the evidence which Dr. Hunter has compiled from the last census, that destruction of houses, notwithstanding increased local demands for them, had during the last 10 years been in progress in 821 separate parishes or townships of England, so that irrespectively of persons who had been forced to become non-resident, that is, in the parishes in which they work, these parishes and townships were receiving in 1861, as compared with 1851, a population 5 1/3% greater into house room 4.5% less. When the process of depopulation has completed itself, the result, says Dr. Hunter, is a show village where the cottages have been reduced to a few, and where none but persons who are needed as shepherds, gardeners, or gamekeepers are allowed to live, regular servants who receive the good treatment usual to their class. Footnote, a show village of this kind looks very nice, but is as unreal as the villages that Catherine II saw on her journey to the Crimea. And commenting, for those who don't know, in order to impress visiting dignitaries, they would literally set up facades of houses so that as you sailed down the river, it would look like there's a village there, but it's really just like, wooden cutouts. Continuing, in recent times, the shepherd also has often been banished from these show villages. For example, near Market Harborough is sheep farm of about 500 acres, which only employs the labor of one man. To reduce the long trudges over these wide plains, the beautiful pastures of Leicester and Northampton, the shepherd used to get a cottage on the farm. Now they give him a 13th shilling a week for lodging, that he must find far away in an open village. And commenting, we've seen this kind of story again with teachers in cities in the United States, where you can't afford to work anywhere near the school where you're teaching, to the point where there are efforts to set up public housing so that you don't have to commute an hour away to be like a junior high teacher. Anyway, back to the main text. But the land requires cultivation, and it will be found that the laborers employed upon it are not the tenants of the owner, but that they come from a neighboring open village, perhaps 3 miles off, where a numerous small proprietary had received them when their cottages were destroyed in the close villages around. Where things are tending to the above result, often the cottages which stand testify, in their unrepaired and wretched condition, to the extinction to which they're doomed. They are seen standing in the various stages of natural decay. While the shelter holds together, the laborer is permitted to rent it, and glad enough he will often be to do so, even at the price of decent lodging. But no repair, no improvement shall it receive, except such as its penniless occupants can supply. And when at last it becomes quite uninhabitable even to the humblest standard of serfdom, it will be but one more destroyed cottage, and future poor rates will be somewhat lightened. While great owners are thus escaping from poor rates through the depopulation of lands over which they have control, the nearest town or open village receive the evicted laborers. The nearest, I say, but this nearest may mean 3 or 4 miles distant from the farm where the laborer has their daily toil. To that daily toil there will then have to be added, as though it were nothing, the daily need of walking 6 or 8 miles for power of earning their bread. And whatever farm work is done by their wife and children is done at the same disadvantage. Nor is this nearly all the toil which the distance occasions them. In the open village, cottage speculators buy scraps of land, which they throng as densely as they can, with the cheapest of all possible hovels, and into those wretched habitations which, even if they adjoin the open country, have some of the worst features of the worst town residences, crowd the agricultural laborers of England. Footnote quoting Dr. Hunter's report, the laborers' houses in the open villages, which of course are always overcrowded, are usually in rows, built with their backs against the extreme edge of the plot of land, which the builder could call his, and on this account are not allowed light and air except from the front, unquote. Very often the beer seller or grocer of the village is at the same time the letter of its houses. In this case, the agricultural laborer finds in them a second master besides the farmer. He must be his customer as well as his tenant. Quoting Dr. Hunter again, the hind with his 10 shillings a week, minus a rent of £4 a year, is obliged to buy at the seller's own terms his modicum of tea, sugar, flour, soap, candles, and beer, unquote. These open villages form, in fact, the penal settlements of the English agricultural proletariat. Many of the cottages are simply lodging houses, through which all the rabble of the neighborhood passes. The country laborer and their family, who had often, in a way truly wonderful, preserved, under the foulest conditions, a thoroughness and purity of character, go in these utterly to the devil. It is, of course, the fashion amongst the aristocratic Shylocks to shrug their shoulders pharisaically at the building speculators, the small landlords, and the open villages. They know well enough that their closed villages and show villages are the birthplaces of the open villages and could not exist without them. Quoting the doctor again, the laborers, were it not for the small owners, would, for by far the most part, have to sleep under the trees of the farms on which they work, unquote. The system of open and closed villages obtains in all the Midland counties and throughout the east of England. Back to the main text. Nor, on the other hand, must it be supposed that even when the laborer is housed upon the lands which they cultivate, their household circumstances are generally such as their life of productive industry would seem to deserve. Even on princely estates, their cottage may be of the meanest description. There are landlords who deem any sty good enough for their laborer and their family, and who yet do not disdain to drive with them the hardest possible bargain for rent. Footnote quoting Dr. Hunter, the employer is directly or indirectly securing to themselves the profit on a man employed at 10 shillings a week and receiving from this poor hind £4 or £5 annual rent for houses not worth £20 in a really free market, but maintained at their artificial value by the power of the owner to say, use my house or go seek a hiring elsewhere, without a character reference from me. Does a man wish to better himself, to go as a plate layer on the railway, or to begin quarry work, the same power is ready with work for me at this low rate of wages, or be gone at a week's notice. Take your pig with you, and get what you can for the potatoes growing in your garden. Should his interest appear to be better served by it, an enhanced rent is sometimes preferred in these cases by the owner, i.e. the farmer, as the penalty for leaving his service, unquote. Back to the main text. It may be but a ruinous one-bedroomed hut, having no fire grate, no privy, no opening window, no water supply but the ditch, no garden, but the laborer is helpless against the wrong, and the Nuisances Removal Acts are a mere dead letter, in great part dependent for their working on such cottage owners as the one from whom the laborer's hovel is rented. From brighter, but exceptional scenes, it is requisite in the interests of justice that attention should again be drawn to the overwhelming preponderance of facts which are a reproach to the civilization of England. Lamentable indeed must be the case when, notwithstanding all that's evident with regard to the quality of the present accommodation, it is the common conclusion of competent observers that even the general badness of dwellings is an evil infinitely less urgent than their mere numerical insufficiency. For years, the overcrowding of rural laborers' dwellings has been a matter of deep concern, not only to persons who care for sanitary good, but to persons who care for decent and moral life. For again and again, in phrases so uniform that they seem stereotyped, reporters on the spread of epidemic disease in rural districts have insisted on the extreme importance of that overcrowding as an influence which renders it a quite hopeless task to attempt the limiting of any infection which is introduced. And again it has been pointed out that, notwithstanding the many salubrious influences which there are in country life, the crowding which so favors the extension of contagious disease also favors the origination of disease which is not contagious, and those who have denounced the overcrowded state of our rural population have not been silent as to a further mischief. Even where their primary concern has been only with the injury to health, often almost perforce they have referred to other relations on the subject. In showing how frequently it happens that adult persons of both sexes, married and unmarried, are huddled together in single, small sleeping rooms, their reports have carried the conviction that, under the circumstances they describe, decency must always be outraged, and morality almost of necessity must suffer. Footnote quoting Dr. Hunter, new married couples are no edifying study for grown-up brothers and sisters, and though instances must not be recorded, sufficient data are remembered to warrant the remark that Great Depression and sometimes death are the lot of the female participator in the offense of incest, unquote. A member of the rural police who had for many years been a detective in the worst quarters of London says of the girls of his village, quote, their boldness and shamelessness I never saw equaled during some years of police life and detective duty in the worst parts of London. They live like pigs, great boys and girls, mothers and fathers, all sleeping in one room in many instances, unquote. Back to the main text. Thus, for instance, in the appendix of my last annual report, Dr. Ord, reporting on an outbreak of fever at Wing in Buckinghamshire, mentions how a young man who had come thither from Wingrave with fever, quote, in the first days of his illness slept in a room with 9 other persons. Within a fortnight, several of these persons were attacked, and in the course of a few weeks, 5 out of the 9 had fever, and 1 died, unquote. From Dr. Harvey of St. George's Hospital, who, on private professional business, visited Wing during the time of the epidemic, I received information exactly in the sense of the above report. Quote, a young woman having fever lay at night in a room occupied by her father and brother, her bastard child, 2 young men, her brothers, and her 2 sisters, each with a bastard child, 10 persons in all. A few weeks ago, 13 persons slept in it. And that's the end of that very long quoted passage from the Public Health 7th Report, 1865. Back to Marx. Dr. Hunter investigated 5,375 cottages of agricultural laborers, not only in the purely agricultural districts, but in all counties of England. Of these, 2,195 had only 1 bedroom, often at the same time used as a living room. 2,930 had only 2, and 250 more than 2. I will give a few specimens culled from a dozen counties. 1. Bedfordshire. Rustlingworth. Bedrooms about 12 feet long and 10 broad, although many are smaller than this. The small, one-storied cots are often divided by partitions into 2 bedrooms, 1 bed frequently in a kitchen, 5 feet 6 inches in height. Rent, £3 a year. The tenants have to make their own privies, the landlord only supplies a hole. As soon as one has made a privy, it is made use of by the whole neighborhood. One house belonging to a family called Richardson was of quite unapproachable beauty. Quote, its plaster walls bulged very like a lady's dress in a curtsy. One gable end was convex, the other concave, and on this last unfortunately stood the chimney, a curved tube of clay and wood like an elephant's trunk. A long stick served as prop to prevent the chimney from falling. The doorway and window were rhomboidal, unquote. Of 17 houses visited, only 4 had more than 1 bedroom, and those 4 overcrowded. The cots with 1 bedroom sheltered 3 adults and 3 children, a married couple with 6 children, etc. In Dunton, high rents from £4 to £5. Weekly wages of the man, 10 shillings. They hoped to pay the rent by the straw plating of the family. The higher the rent, the greater the number that must work together to pay it. 6 adults, living with 4 children in 1 sleeping apartment, pay £3, 10 shillings for it. The cheapest house in Dunton, 15 feet long externally, 10 broad, let for £3. Only one of the houses investigated had 2 bedrooms. A little outside the village, a house whose, quote, tenants dunged against the house side, unquote, the lower 9 inches of the door eaten away through sheer rottenness. The doorway, a single opening closed at night by a few bricks, ingeniously pushed up after shutting and covered with some matting. Half a window, with glass and frame, had gone the way of all flesh. Here, without furniture, huddled together were 3 adults and 5 children. Dunton is not worse than the rest of Biggleswade Union. 2. Berkshire. Beanham. In June 1864, a man, his wife, and 4 children lived in a cot, a 1-storied cottage. A daughter came home from service with scarlet fever. She died. 1 child sickened and died. The mother and 1 child were down with typhus when Dr. Hunter was called in. The father and 1 child slept outside. But the difficulty of securing isolation was seen here, for in the crowded market of the miserable village lay the linen of the fever-stricken household waiting for the wash. The rent of H's house, 1 shilling a week, 1 bedroom for man, wife, and 6 children. 1 house let for 8d a week, 14 feet 6 inches long, 7 feet broad, kitchen 6 feet high, the bedroom without window, fireplace, door, or opening, except into the lobby, no garden. A man lived here for a little while with 2 grown-up daughters and 1 grown-up son. Father and son slept on the bed, the girls in the passage. Each of the latter had a child while the family was living here, but one went to the workhouse for her confinement and then came home. 3. Buckinghamshire. 30 cottages on 1,000 acres of land contained here about 130 to 140 persons. The parish of Bradenham comprises 1,000 acres. It numbered in 1851 36 houses and a population of 84 males and 54 females. This inequality of the sexes was partly remedied in 1861 when they numbered 98 males and 87 females. Increase in 10 years of 14 men and 33 women. Meanwhile, the number of houses was 1 less. Winslow. A great part of this was newly built in good style. The demand for houses appears very marked, since very miserable cots are let at 1 shilling to 1 shilling 3d per week. Water Eaton. Here the landlords, in view of the increasing population, have destroyed about 20% of the existing houses. A poor laborer, who had to go about 4 miles to his work, answered the question whether he could not find a cot nearer, quote, "No, they know better than to take a man in with my large family." Tinker's End, near Winslow. A bedroom in which were 4 adults and 4 children, 11 feet long, 9 feet broad, 6 feet 5 inches high at its highest part. Another 11 feet 3 inches by 9 feet, 5 feet 10 inches high, sheltered 6 persons. Each of these families had less space than is considered necessary for a convict. No house had more than 1 bedroom, not one of them a back door, water very scarce, weekly rent from 1 shilling 4 pence to 2 shillings. In 16 of the houses visited, only 1 man that earned 10 shillings a week. The quantity of air for each person, under the circumstances just described, corresponds to that which they would have if they were shut up in a box of 4 feet measuring each way the whole night. But then the ancient dens afforded a certain amount of unintentional ventilation. 4. Cambridgeshire. Gamblingay belongs to several landlords. It contains the wretchedest cots to be found anywhere, much straw plating, quote, "A deadly lassitude, a hopeless surrendering up to filth," unquote, reigns in Gamblingay. The neglect in its center becomes mortification at its extremities, north and south, where the houses are rotting to pieces. The absentee landlords bleed this poor rookery too freely. The rents are very high, 8 or 9 persons packed in 1 sleeping apartment. In 2 cases, 6 adults, each with 1 or 2 children in 1 small bedroom. 5. Essex. In this county, diminutions in the number of persons and of cottages go, in many parishes, hand in hand. In not less than 22 parishes, however, the destruction of houses has not prevented increase of population, or has not brought about that expulsion which, under the name migration to towns, generally occurs. In Fingringhoe, a parish of 3,443 acres, were, in 1851, 145 houses. In 1861, only 110. But the people did not wish to go away, and managed even to increase under these circumstances. In 1851, 252 persons inhabited 61 houses. But in 1861, 262 persons were squeezed into 49 houses. In Basildon, in 1851, 157 persons lived on 1,827 acres in 35 houses. At the end of 10 years, 180 persons in 27 houses. In the parishes of Fingringhoe, South Fambridge, Woodford, Basildon, and Ramsden Crags, in 1851, 1,392 persons were living on 8,449 acres in 316 houses. In 1861, on the same area, 1,473 persons in 249 houses. 6. Herefordshire. This little county has suffered more from the eviction spirit than any other in England. At Nadby, overcrowded cottages generally, with only 2 bedrooms, belonging for the most part to the farmers. They easily let them for £3 or £4 a year, and paid a weekly wage of 9 shillings. 7. Huntingdon. Hertford had, in 1851, 87 houses. Shortly after this, 19 cottages were destroyed in this small parish of 1,720 acres. Population in 1831, 452. In 1852, 382. And in 1861, 341. 14 cottages, each with 1 bedroom, were visited. In one, a married couple, 3 grown-up sons, 1 grown-up daughter, 4 children, in all 10. In other, 3 adults, 6 children. One of these rooms, in which 8 people slept, was 12 feet 10 inches long, 12 feet 2 inches broad, 6 feet 9 inches high. The average, without making any deduction for projections into the apartment, gave about 130 cubic feet per head. In the 14 sleeping rooms, 34 adults and 33 children. These cottages are seldom provided with gardens, but many of the inmates are able to farm small allotments at 10 shillings or 12 shillings per rood. These allotments are at a distance from the houses, which are without privies. The family, quote, must either go to the allotment to deposit their ordures, unquote, or, as happens in this place, saving your presence, quote, use a closet with a trough set like a drawer in a chest of drawers, and drawn out weekly, and conveyed to the allotment to be emptied where its contents were wanted, unquote. In Japan, the circle of life conditions moves more decently than this. 8. Lincolnshire. Langtoft. A man lives here, in Wright's house, with his wife, her mother, and 5 children. The house has a front kitchen, scullery, bedroom over the front kitchen. Front kitchen and bedroom, 12 feet 2 inches by 9 feet 5 inches. The whole ground floor, 21 feet 2 inches by 9 feet 5 inches. The bedroom is a garret. The walls run together into the roof like a sugar loaf, a dormer window opening in front. Questions were asked. Why did he live here? On account of the garden? No, it's very small. Rent? It's high, 1 shilling 3 pence per week. Is it near his work? No, 6 miles away, so that he walks daily, to and fro, 12 miles. He lived there because it was a tenantable cot, unquote, and because he wanted to have a cot for himself alone, anywhere, at any price, and in any conditions. The following are the statistics of 12 houses in Langtoft, with 12 bedrooms, 38 adults, and 36 children. So there's a chart here labeled 12 houses in Langtoft, and it shows the number of bedrooms, the number of adults, the number of children, and the total number of persons. Each of the houses has 1 bedroom, and the number of adults ranges from 2 to 5. The number of children also ranges from 0 to 5, and the total number of persons ranges from 2 to 9. 9. Kent. Kennington, very seriously overpopulated in 1859 when diphtheria appeared, and the parish doctor instituted a medical inquiry into the condition of the poorer classes. He found that in this locality, where much labor is employed, various cots had been destroyed, and no new ones built. In one district stood 4 houses named bird cages. Each had 4 rooms of the following dimensions in feet and inches. Kitchen, 9 feet 5 inches by 8 feet 11 inches by 6 feet 6 inches. Scullery, 8 feet 6 inches by 4 feet 6 by 6 feet 6. Bedroom 1, 8 feet 5 inches by 5 foot 10 by 6 foot 3. Bedroom 2, 8 feet 3 inches by 8 feet 4 inches by 6 feet 3 inches. 10. Northamptonshire. Brinworth, Pickford, and Flor. In these villages, in the winter, 20 to 30 men were lounging about the streets from want of work. The farmers do not always till sufficiently the corn and turnip lands, and the landlord has found it best to throw all his farms together into 2 or 3, hence want of employment. Whilst on one side of the wall the land calls for labor, on the other side the defrauded laborers are casting at it longing glances. Feverishly overworked in summer and half-starved in winter, it is no wonder if they say in their peculiar dialect, "The parson and gentlefolk seem frit to death at them." At Flor, instances of 1 bedroom of the smallest size, of couples with 4, 5, or 6 children, 3 adults with 5 children, a couple with grandfather, and 6 children down with scarlet fever, etc., in 2 houses with 2 bedrooms, 2 families of 8, and 9 adults respectively. 11. Wiltshire. Stratton. 31 houses visited, 8 with only 1 bedroom. Pentle, in the same parish, a cot let at 1 shilling 3 pence weekly, with 4 adults and 4 children, have nothing good about it except the walls, from the floor of roughly hewn pieces of stone to the roof of worn-out thatch. 12. Worcestershire. House destruction here not quite so excessive, yet from 1851 to 1861, the number of inhabitants to each house on the average has risen from 4.2 to 4.6. Badsey. Many cots and little gardens here. Some of the farmers declare that the cots are, quote, "a great nuisance here because they bring the poor," unquote. On the statement of one gentleman, quote, "The poor are none the better for them. If you build 500, they will let fast enough. In fact, the more you build, the more they want," unquote. Comment, imagine that. People need housing. Continuing, according to him, the houses give birth to the inhabitants, who then by a law of nature press on the, quote, "means of housing," unquote. Dr. Hunter remarks, quote, "Now these poor must come from somewhere, and as there is no particular attraction, such as doles, or welfare, at Badsey, it must be repulsion from some other unfit place which will send them here. If each could find an allotment near their work, they would not prefer Badsey, where they pay for their scrap of ground twice as much as the farmer pays for his," unquote. The continual emigration to the towns, the continual formation of surplus population in the country through the concentration of farms, conversion of arable land into pasture, machinery, etc., and the continual eviction of the agricultural population by the destruction of their cottages go hand in hand. The more empty the district is of men, the greater is its, quote, "relative surplus population." The greater is their pressure on the means of employment. The greater is the absolute excess of the agricultural population over the means for housing it. The greater, therefore, in the villages is the local surplus population and the most pestilential packing together of human beings. The packing together of knots of men in scattered little villages and small country towns corresponds to the forcible draining of men from the surface of the land. The continuous superseding of the agricultural laborers, in spite of their diminishing number and the increasing mass of their products, gives birth to their pauperism. Their pauperism is ultimately a motive to their eviction and the chief source of their miserable housing, which breaks down their last power of resistance and makes them more slaves of the landed proprietors and the farmers. Footnote quoting Dr. Hunter, "The heaven-born employment of the hind gives dignity even to his position. He is not a slave but a soldier of peace, and deserves his place in married men's quarters to be provided by the landlord, who has claimed a power of enforced labor similar to that the country demands of the soldier. He no more receives market price for his work than does the soldier. Like the soldier, he is caught young, ignorant, knowing only his own trade and his own locality. Early marriage and the operation of the various laws of settlement affect the one as enlistment and the Mutiny Act affect the other." Unquote. Sometimes an exceptionally soft-hearted landlord relents as the solitude he has created. Quote, "It is a melancholy thing to stand alone in one's country," said Lord Leicester when complimented on the completion of Hookham. Quote, "I look around and not a house is to be seen but mine. I am the giant of Giant Castle and have eat up all my neighbors." Unquote. Comment. That's kind of chilling, actually. Back to the main text. Thus, the minimum of wages becomes a law of nature to them. On the other hand, the land, in spite of its constant relative surplus population, is at the same time underpopulated. This is seen not only locally at the points where the efflux of men to towns, mines, railroad making, etc. is most marked. It is to be seen everywhere, in harvest time as well as in spring and summer, at those frequently recurring times when English agriculture, so careful and intensive, wants extra hands. There are always too many agricultural laborers for the ordinary, and always too few for the exceptional or temporary needs of the cultivation of the soil. Footnote. A similar movement is seen during the last 10 years in France. In proportion as capitalist production there takes possession of agriculture, it drives the surplus agricultural population into the towns. Here also we find deterioration in the housing and other conditions at the source of the surplus population. On the special Proletariat foncier, or land proletariat, to which the system of parceling out the land has given rise, see among others the work of Collin, already quoted, and Karl Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 2nd edition, 1869. In 1846, the town population in France was represented by 24.42%, the agricultural by 75.58%. In 1861, the town by 28.86%, the agricultural by 71.14%. During the last 5 years, the diminution of the agricultural percentage of the population has been yet more marked. As early as 1846, Pierre Dupont, in his Workers or Ouvriers, sang, "Badly clothed, living in holes, under the eaves, in the ruins, with the owls and the thieves, companions of the shadows." Back to the main text. Hence we find in the official documents contradictory complaints from the same places of deficiency and excess of labor simultaneously. The temporary or local want of labor brings about no rise in wages, but instead a forcing of the women and children into the fields, and exploitation at an age constantly lowered. As soon as the exploitation of the women and children takes place on a larger scale, it becomes in turn a new means of making a surplus population of the male agricultural laborer, and of keeping down his wage. In the east of England thrives a beautiful fruit of this vicious circle, the so-called gang system, to which I must briefly return here. And there's a footnote that the sixth and last report of the Children's Employment Commission, published at the end of March 1867, deals solely with the agricultural gang system. Continuing the main text, the gang system obtains almost exclusively in the counties of Lincoln, Huntingdon, Cambridge, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Nottingham, here and there in the neighboring counties of Northampton, Bedford, and Rutland. Lincolnshire will serve us as an example. A large part of this county is new land. Marsh formerly, or even, as in others of the eastern counties just named, won lately from the sea. The steam engine has worked wonders in the way of drainage. What once were fens and sandbanks bear now a luxuriant sea of corn and the highest of rents. The same thing holds of the alluvial lands won by human endeavor, as in the island of Axholme and other parishes on the banks of the Trent. In proportion as the new farms arose, not only were no new cottages built, old ones were demolished, and the supply of labor had to come from open villages, miles away, by long roads that wound along the sides of the hills. There alone had the population formerly found shelter from the incessant floods of the winter time. The laborers that dwell on the farms of 400 to 1,000 acres, they are called confined laborers, are solely employed on such kinds of agricultural work as is permanent, difficult, and carried on by aid of horses. For every 100 acres, there is, on an average, scarcely one cottage. A fen farmer, for example, gave evidence before the Commission of Inquiry, quote, "I farm 320 acres, all arable land. I have not one cottage on my farm. I have only one laborer on my farm now. I have 4 horsemen lodging about. we get light work done by gangs. That's quoting the Child's Employment Commission's 6th report. The soil requires much light field labor, such as weeding, hoeing, certain processes of manuring, removing of stones, etc. This is done by the gangs, or organized bands that dwell in the open villages. The gang consists of 10 to 40 or 50 persons, women, young persons of both sexes, 13 to 18 years of age, although the boys are for the most part eliminated at the age of 13, and children of both sexes, 6 to 13 years of age. At the head is the gang master, always an ordinary agricultural laborer, generally what is called a bad lot, a scapegrace, unsteady, drunken, but with a dash of enterprise and savoir-faire. He is the recruiting sergeant for the gang, which works under him, not under the farmer. He generally arranges with the latter for piecework, and his income, which on the average is not very much above that of an ordinary agricultural laborer, depends almost entirely upon the dexterity with which he manages to extract within the shortest time the greatest possible amount of labor from his gang. Footnote regarding gangmasters' income: some gangmasters have worked themselves up to the position of farmers of 500 acres, or proprietors of whole rows of houses. Back to the main text. The farmers have discovered that women work steadily only under the direction of men, but that women and children, once set going, impetuously spend their life force, as Fourier knew, while the adult male laborer is shrewd enough to economize his as much as he can. The gangmaster goes from one farm to another, and thus employs his gang from 6 to 8 months in the year. Employment by him is therefore much more lucrative and more certain for the laboring families than employment by the individual farmer, who only employs children occasionally. This circumstance so completely rivets his influence in the open villages that children are generally only to be hired through his instrumentality. The lending out of these individually, independently of the gang, is his second trade. The quote drawbacks of the system are the overwork of the children and young persons, the enormous marches that they make daily to and from the farms, 5, 6, and sometimes 7 miles distant. Finally, the demoralization of the gang. Although the gangmaster, who in some districts is called the driver, is armed with a long stick, he uses it but seldom, and complaints of brutal treatment are exceptional. He is a democratic emperor, or a kind of Pied Piper of Hamelin. He must therefore be popular with his subjects, and he binds them to himself by the charms of the gypsy life under his direction. Coarse freedom, a noisy jollity, and obscenest impudence give attractions to the gang. Generally, the gangmaster pays up in a public house, then he returns home at the head of the procession reeling drunk, propped up right and left by a stalwart virago, while children and young persons bring up the rear, boisterous, and singing chaffing and bawdy songs. On the return journey, what Fourier calls phanerogamy is the order of the day. The getting with child of girls 13 and 14 by their male companions of the same age is common. The open villages which supply the contingent of the gang become Sodoms and Gomorrahs, and have twice as high a rate of illegitimate births as the rest of the kingdom. Footnote, quoting the Child's Employment Commission report, half of the girls of Ludford have been ruined by going out in gangs. Back to the main text. The moral character of girls bred in these schools, when married women, was shown above. Their children, when opium does not give them the finishing stroke, are born recruits of the gang. The gang, in its classical form just described, is called the public, common, or tramping gang. For there are also private gangs. These are made up in the same way as the common gang, but count fewer members and work, not under a gangmaster, but under some old farm servant, whom the farmer does not know how to employ in any better way. The gypsy fun has vanished here, but according to all witnesses, the payment and treatment of the children is worse. The gang system, which during the last years has steadily increased, clearly does not exist for the sake of the gangmaster. Footnote, quoting the Child's Employment Commission report again, they, gangs, have greatly increased of late years. In some places they're said to have been introduced at comparatively late dates. In others, where gangs have been known for many years, more and younger children are employed in them. Back to the main text. The gang system exists for the enrichment of the large farmers, and indirectly of the landlords. 2 footnotes, the first again quoting the Child's Employment Commission report, small farmers never employ gangs. It is not on poor land, but on land which affords rent of from 40 to 50 shillings that women and children are employed in the greatest numbers, unquote. Second footnote, to one of these gentlemen the taste of his rent was so grateful that he indignantly declared to the Commission of Inquiry that the whole hubbub was only due to the name of the system. If instead of gang, it were called the Agricultural Juvenile Industrial Self-Supporting Association, everything would be all right. Back to the main text. For the farmer, there is no more ingenious method of keeping his laborers well below the normal level, and yet of always having an extra hand ready for extra work, of extracting the greatest possible amount of labor with the least possible amount of money, and of making adult male labor redundant. Footnote, again quoting the report, "Gang work is cheaper than other work. That is why they're employed," says a former gang master. "The gang system is decidedly the cheapest for the farmer, and decidedly the worst for the children," says a farmer. Back to the main text. From the exposition already made, it will be understood why, on the one hand, a greater or less lack of employment for the agricultural laborer is admitted, while on the other the gang system is at the same time declared necessary, on account of the want of adult male labor and its migration to the towns. Footnote, again quoting the report, "Undoubtedly much of the work now done by children in gangs used to be done by men and women. More men are out of work now where children and women are employed than formerly." Unquote. On the other hand, quote, "The labor question in some agricultural districts, particularly the arable, is becoming so serious in consequence of emigration and the facility afforded by railways for getting to large towns that I being the steward of a great lord, thinks the services of children are most indispensable." Unquote. For the labor question in English agricultural districts, differently from the rest of the civilized world, means the landlords and farmers question, viz., how is it possible, despite an always increasing exodus of the agricultural folk, to keep up a sufficient relative surplus population in the country, and by means of it, keep the wages of the agricultural laborer at a minimum? Back to the main text. The cleanly weeded land and the uncleanly human weeds of Lincolnshire are pole and counterpole of capitalistic production. Footnote, the Public Health Report, wherein dealing with the subject of children's mortality, the gang system is treated in passing, remains unknown to the press, and therefore to the English public. On the other hand, the last report of the Child's Employment Commission afforded the press sensational copy always welcome. Whilst the liberal press asked how the fine gentlemen and ladies, and the well-paid clergy of the state church with whom Lincolnshire swarms, could allow such a system to arise on their estates, under their very eyes, they who send out expressly missions to the Antipodes, quote, "for the improvement of the morals of South Sea Islanders," the more refined press confined itself to reflections on the coarse degradation of the agricultural population who are capable of selling their children into such slavery. Under the accursed conditions to which these quote-unquote delicate people condemn the agricultural laborer, it would not be surprising if he ate his own children. What is really wonderful is the healthy integrity of character he has in great part retained. The official reports prove that the parents, even in the gang districts, loathe the gang system. Quote, "There is much in the evidence that shows that the parents of the children would, in many instances, be glad to be aided by the requirements of a legal obligation to resist the pressure and the temptations to which they are often subject. They are liable to be urged, at times by the parish officers, at times by employers, under threats of being themselves discharged, to be taken to work at an age when school attendance would be manifestly to their greater advantage. All that time and strength wasted, all the suffering from extra and unprofitable fatigue produced to the laborer and to his children, every instance in which the parent may have traced the moral ruin of his child to the undermining of delicacy by the overcrowding of cottages, or to the contaminating influences of the public gang, must have been so many incentives to feelings in the minds of the laboring poor, which can be well understood, and which it would be needless to particularize. They must be conscious that much bodily and mental pain has thus been inflicted upon them from causes for which they were in no way answerable, to which, had it been in their power, they would have in no way consented, and against which they were powerless to struggle." Unquote.